I went through it every time the Eagles have picked 16 or above in the past 21 years, which is really the beginning of the DNA of this organization. That's why I started there, because that's when Andy got here, and that's when they inserted this belief system. So even if you go, I mentioned the top 10 picks before. It was Donovan McNabb, Corey Simon, who was a defensive tackle, Lane Johnson, obviously, and Carson Wentz. That's it. So I haven't drafted that high because they've been pretty good for the majority of the year. So you can say, well, that's not a huge sample size. Well, then you go to 16 or above, so top half of the draft. It's the Broderick Bunkleys of the world. And more recently, obviously, they've hit on players like Fletcher Cox and Brandon Graham. Derek Barnett at 14 is another example. Sean Andrews. Always offensive, defensive line. When they're up that high, they pick the positions they value, and that's what Bill Belichick was talking about.
I don't think our next guest here has any action on this game. He's, he's not too into college hoops. I think he's turning it on once the Final Four is set. John McMullen, he joins me every night right here on The Fix at 7:30. Follow him on Twitter at JFMcMullen, PhillyVoice.com, SI.com, host of Extending the Play right here on 1490, Saturdays at 10 a.m. And coming soon, right, John? Birds 365.
Yeah, Birds 365. We are at 1 week in counting. Next Monday, the first episode will be in the can. Hopefully. I had a vaccine today, so who knows what happens.
All right. So you got the part one of the vaccination today, huh?
Part one, which I don't like to publicize, so I don't know why I said that, because I can't stand when everybody goes on social media and puts their card up and shames people and, do what you want. That's what I say.
You didn't post your sticker, John? You got vaccinated?
I did not post my sticker. Get a card. You get a card.
Right, okay.
It's just interesting. I'm sure there's going to be some kind of scandal at some point where somebody steals these stupid cards. Boy, we've gone off on a tangent really quickly.
Yeah, we have. It escalated quickly. All right, let's get it back on the rails. All right, we're going to get into plenty of the updates surrounding the Philadelphia Eagles, of course, but I have to start with this. Everyone has lost their minds over this Wilson Pro Day, and it's ridiculous, man.
Yes, it is. What's more, boy, I'll tell you, if I read another 4-4, what a I joked on Twitter the other day, great athlete shows great athleticism. Wow. What do you expect? I don't. Look, he's thrown against air. We all know. My favorite was Johnny Manziel, because that was just, he had the broom out and everybody was raving about it. I'm like, come on. In a lot of ways, because you think about this unique year, and we're just talking about vaccines. We've just been through this terrible pandemic. There were, obviously no off-season work. We've talked about it a ton. Guys opted out left and right in college football. Some places didn't even play. Other places started late. And so many big-name players, said, heck, if something happened midway through the season, they said, I'm done. I'm going to prepare for the NFL draft. And what they do is there's this cottage industry now where you have these training facilities that prepare people for the NFL Combine, NFL, obviously, level athletes. So they're actually spending their time training for three cones and shuttle drills and the 40-yard dash instead of, practicing football. So I think it's going to be interesting to see, how this shakes out, because you had so many, one of them today, you know, Gregory Rousseau, the Miami pass rush. I mean, there's been so many players that just said, I'm going to prepare for the NFL draft, and there's not much film on them. So it's going to be interesting to see how scouts and personnel people handle it.
I like that, John, and here's why. Because, well, number one, let me ask you this. All right, there is way too much hype, we know, on social media and from the fans about, you know, pro days and guys in T-shirts and shorts throwing with no opponents, you know, no defenders, no pass rush. Maybe a stupid question, but the teams and NFL scouts, they're not looking at it as intensely with the same amount of importance as the fans are, right? Because this has gained a ton of traction over the past 10 years. It hasn't always been like this, but have teams, you know, upped their ante with this, so to speak, too?
No, I don't think so. I've talked to a lot of scouts over the years when there was a combine, and they said, you know, it's about, you know, it's goofy to put percentages on things, but you know how NFL people are, so they would say like it's 80% film, and you know you have to reach a certain level of athleticism to be an NFL player, and once you hit that bar, they sort of go to the film and sort of rely on that. However, that's what I'm saying. There's not a ton of film for certain players, and sometimes there's only a year. Because they opted out or they didn't want to play. So it from that standpoint, it becomes more difficult. It's, you know, it's already difficult to evaluate. It's easy to see what somebody did. The trick is to say, what are they going to do? And that's where the projection is the big part of this, and that's the trick. So it does make it more difficult. I will say that. But now what most NFL teams do is, and now they have, obviously, easier ways to put together the data. So they look at successful players at each position and look at what they did at the combine or their pro days and say, okay, this is what you need to be successful at this position. That's generally how they do it, but that's all 32 teams. So I don't think it's that big of a deal. But one thing, and I wanted to bring this up with you, Ryan, because you know, it is sort of a new, and I think the best example of this is Ben Simmons with the Sixers. And, you know, every offseason you would have those social media posts about him practicing and hitting threes and practice, and everybody would get so excited. And then he shows up and he doesn't shoot threes. Like, I'm thinking to myself the other day, Jalen Hurts is a new generation type of athlete. He's social media savvy. He's always posting videos of himself working out. And I admit, I'm pretty impressed. But should I be? You know, are they just doing this because they're marketing people, their agents tell them, because this is what you're supposed to do? Like, it's a murky sort of scene.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question / topic, and the answer is, should you be? The answer is no. I mean, you're allowed to get excited, but you can't look at those videos as like the truth, as that is evidence of evolution or what's to come on game day. I used to say that about these Ben Simmons videos. I would say, this is awesome. It's great to see. But I haven't seen it yet in the game. Like, we cannot look at what these guys post for their quote-unquote brand and say, this is the guy we're going to get come Sunday, come tip-off, whatever it may be. Because there's a lot of different aspects now to the modern-day professional athlete. They are now a brand. They know it. The representation knows it. So you can't look at Ben Simmons in a YMCA empty gym and say he's going to be the next Reggie Miller. He can't.
Yeah, and I think I kind of caught myself because I've been saying, you know, one thing, and it's that for most, because, you know, talking to people outside, everyone has indicated that by no means am I trying to take a shot at Jalen Hurts, because everyone says he's a hard worker, and he does do everything he needs to do. That's one thing even the old coaching staff said is he was always staying after. He was always grabbing coaches. He was always walking in the coaches' offices trying to get better. So that's the kind of part I lean on. But then you get the videos and, people get excited about them. And it just hit me the other day. It really did. It was a couple of days ago. And I said, you know what? This is what you're supposed to do now. So I'm not, I'm not as impressed by that stuff, when that clicked for me. It is a brand. It is a marketing thing. And that's part of it. Now, again, I think from his standpoint, I think he's a hard worker. But I don't think he's a hard worker because of videos posted on Twitter is what I'm trying to say.
Right. No, he's, if he was, the 20 years ago athlete, he would still be a hard worker. It's in his DNA. I get what you're saying completely. But here's the bottom line. This is something that can't be simulated. This is something that no one can really practice for. Well, you can, but it's not on the field. It's how do these guys react when bleep hits the fan? So how does Jalen Hurts react when the city of Philadelphia is calling for his head, when they're sick of him? Like Carson Wentz, he was a hard worker. He was an MVP. All of a sudden, things got tough. And I know there were some things that weren't his fault, but overall, he couldn't handle the heat. So those are the things that when the tough gets going, what happens?
Yeah, you never know. And you're right. And I think that's where we are at quarterback for the Eagles, because I think you can't make the same assessment. I think Jeffrey Lurie's are almost going in that direction. Like he's acknowledging we made a mistake by screwing with the psyche of Carson Wentz, and I think they did, and I think they did make a mistake. So that part of it is good. But I think the assumption that everyone has the same personality and everybody's going to act the same way, I don't think is good. Because I think Jalen Hurts, and he's already been through it at Alabama, doesn't have the same personality. I don't think, in other words, he's not going to be affected if you bring in a quarterback at number 6 overall. He's going to go out and compete. That's just the way he is. So I think the Eagles kind of overcorrected and said, well, we can't do that because then we'll mess up Jalen Hurts. I just don't agree with that.
And one more.
And the second part is obviously Wentz was the guy with the high-level top 5 skill set, whereas in theory, if you've got a quarterback this time around, that's the guy with the high-level skill set. And Jalen's a second round. That's just reality. He doesn't have that type of base skill set.
And I look at Carter Hart for the Philadelphia Flyers, and just bear with me for a second because I remember being on another platform and we were saying, man, it's time to call up Carter Hart. And one thing that a lot of people pointed to, giving him credit, was he has and had a sports psychologist, and he talked about it. He said, listen, I want to make sure I'm mentally tough. I've struggled when I was younger, and as I get ready to become a pro, I want to work on the mental aspect of it as well. And you look at him now, and he is really struggling. But I bring that example up because how do these teams maybe try and gather research to figure out who is mentally tough? I mean, it's probably near impossible, but I'm curious.
It is impossible, and that's one of the biggest things. You always, and it's become a cliche, and people laugh at it. I chuckled at it. You always hear coaches saying, we want guys who love ball. Nick Sirianni was out there. We made fun of him. Love ball. We got to get guys who love ball. You do, basically. The question is, how do you find that? Remember, there's guys, obviously, who can make a lot of money. There are guys who, would probably prefer tight ends. You think about an NFL-level tight end. A lot of those guys wanted to play basketball, and they got too big, or they got, something else. And they said, you know what? You probably got a better chance to go in a different direction. In a much tougher sport from a physical standpoint, you can get hurt, you can get injured, you don't make as much money. So a lot of guys don't love ball. And a lot of guys do this because they're physically equipped to do it, and they make a lot of money, and there's no other avenue for them to do it. And those are the kind of guys that sort of flame out really, really quickly. And then you have other people who do love the sport and go above and beyond and do all that. But, how do you decipher between the two when, and I always, try to tell fans, think of it from your own perspective. When you have a job interview, what do? You put your best foot forward. I mean, even the best of us, we might not lie. We might not even embellish, but you're only pointing out your good characteristics unless you're a moron and say, no, I stink at this. I stink at this. I don't really like doing this. Same thing for NFL players. They're going through this whole process now. They're not going to say, I don't love football. I don't feel like working. I don't feel like doing this 24/7. I only do this because I'm gifted and I can make money. Nobody's saying that. Nobody's volunteering that.
No.
And that's why it's so hard.
I mean, what's the most important department if you're starting if you have a Fortune 500 company, or whatever it is? I would say the most important department, well, it's marketing, of course, but 1A, 1B, human resources. Like, you need the right employees, and your human resources department can't just receive a resume and trust that it's all accurate or not call the references. Like, and I look at that the same as the NFL scouting departments. Like, some people are really good at interviews. So are you going to sit down with a player and just take him for his word? Or are you going to investigate what time did he arrive in the weight room? On days off, was he ever in the facility? Like those are the things that you really have to dig deep and try and find out.
Yeah, and that's, people laugh at the movie again, Draft Day, with Kevin Costner. And there was the one scene where, the projected number 1 overall pick, nobody went to his 21st birthday party because they didn't like him. He was a quarterback. And, it's very Hollywood-ish. It's very silly. But that's the kind of thing where, yeah, the analytics people will chuckle at and say, oh, he's just an old school idiot. And guess what? If you're a quarterback and nobody likes you, and I'm not going to say nobody didn't like Carson Wentz because plenty of people did, but you saw it on a much lesser degree. There were some people he alienated. So how do you figure that out? It's not easy. And that's why you see the goofy questions occasionally. And you'll see how people react. And that's sort of what you try to throw somebody a curveball. Now, a lot of these questions where teams have gotten in trouble before asking players if they were, heterosexual or not, you can't do that anymore. You could do that many years ago. That's why they would ask these questions.
Right, just to try and rattle them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And, it's certainly not a science, but it does, if you can get somebody up, because these players today are over-prepared. We just talked about it. From a physical standpoint, they're actually training for these drills. Years ago, when the NFL Combine really first started to become a thing, guys would just show up. And you knew it was real. Like, if somebody was fast, Deion Sanders, he was fast compared to other football players because he wasn't sitting at an Exos training facility training for 6 weeks to run a 40. He just went out and ran a 40. Now, he did his normal training. I'm not saying he's out smoking cigarettes, but he did just his normal work, and then showed up and did the combine. Now you have guys specifically over-preparing not only for the physical stuff, but for the other stuff as well, whether it's the Wonderlic test or whether it's the interviews. They're all getting prepped by their agents and their marketing people. So everybody's over-prepared, and you're getting that sort of finished product that's been polished by people behind the scenes. So in a lot of ways, it's even more difficult now than it's ever been.
We're going to get your thoughts again on what the Eagles could potentially do at 12. We'll get into that in about 5 minutes or so. But I want to bring this up as well, because I just think we're having a good little interesting conversation here. Bill Belichick, this is an article from a couple years ago from BusinessInsider.com. And it points out Bill Belichick's 4 keys to drafting players. Number 1, he's always about building a team. He's not trying to collect talent. 2, it's all about not falling in love with a player. He's always looking at value. 3, the draft room always has to be very small. And 4, he only wants to coach people/players that he likes. It sounds simple, but I don't think many people are going about it that way.
No, I think people are shocked. In fact, the Patriots are the one team, it was a couple of years ago, where their draft board for the entire draft was 75 players deep. That's the only players they were going to draft. They cut it down to 75 players. And if you weren't on that list, they were just going to trade out wherever, and they just weren't going to take a guy that they didn't want. Now, most teams whittle it down to about 150 is about the average, maybe a little bit less. But that's how fine-tuned it was for that organization at their height. They don't get down to that number every year, but I mean, there's so many players that teams aren't even considering. So you'll see all these draft guides come out this week. You'll see all these draft websites, 400 players. There's not an NFL team in the world that has 400 players on their board. For that reason, those reasons you just kind of said about. And you mentioned 12 with the Eagles and Howie Roseman. I wrote about this on Philly Voice. Valuation of the positions you feel are worthy of that spot. And the history of the Eagles tells you all that, and I encourage everybody to read that article because it look at the top 10 picks the Eagles have had since 1999, and even the top half of the draft, so 16 or above. It's quarterback, it's offensive line, it's defensive line. So everybody's running with their, head cut off. Kyle Pitts. Eagles aren't taking a tight end at 6. Period. End of sentence.
Let's get into that article a little bit as we'll transition to the 12th overall pick with the Philadelphia Eagles. You can just kind of take the wheel here for a second. Some names that they're looking at. Your thoughts on value and who would be the best pick given the positions that they need the most, and everything else that you maybe mentioned in the article.
Yeah, I do think it'll be interesting to see who falls. If a Devontae Smith or even a Jalen Waddle is there. I do want to see how that shakes out because, and again, I went through it every time the Eagles have picked 16 or above in the past 21 years, which is really the beginning of the DNA of this organization. That's why I started there, because that's when Andy got here, and that's when they inserted this belief system. So even if you go, I mentioned the top 10 picks before. It was Donovan McNabb, Corey Simon, who was a defensive tackle, Lane Johnson, obviously, and Carson Wentz. That's it. So they haven't drafted that high because they've been pretty good for the majority of the year. So you can say, well, that's not a huge sample size. Well, then you go to 16 or above, so top half of the draft. It's the Robert Bunkleys of the world. And more recently, obviously, they've hit on players like Fletcher Cox and Brandon Graham. Derek Barnett at 14 is another example. Sean Andrews. Always offensive, defensive line. When they're up that high, they pick the positions they value, and that's what Bill Belichick was talking about. So the first thing I start at defensive tackle, and again, defensive line, offensive line. It's obviously not going to be quarterback. And then I looked at what Andy said in his interview, that Joe Banner always says. And what did Andy Reid say? He said, give me a quarterback, 2 pass rushers, 2 tackles, offensive tackles, 2 cornerbacks, and I'll figure out the rest.
Yeah.
So that should tell everybody what they need. It's going to be offensive line, defensive line, or cornerback.
So offensive line, defensive line, or quarterback, and they essentially eliminated quarterback because they're thinking.
Well, I say or corner.
Oh, corner. Sorry. Yeah, corner. And I'll still throw this out there. They eliminated quarterback because they say we'll go with one of those other needs and acquire more assets to potentially put us in a better position next year for a quarterback, right?
Well, no, they eliminated quarterback because they couldn't get the quarterback they wanted, and they knew there was a firewall, and that's Zach Wilson. And I should say, obviously, Trevor Lawrence doesn't enter this conversation because everybody knows they can't get Trevor Lawrence. So everybody wants Trevor Lawrence. Nobody can get Trevor Lawrence. So we put him aside. After that, it's Zach Wilson. The Eagles probably couldn't have gotten him anyway because the Jets are going to probably take him at number 2. But there was at least a thought that maybe the Jets might take Sewell. Maybe they go in a different direction. Then you start talking about, can we get up to number 3? Obviously, Miami wanted out because they traded out. And San Francisco got up there to take the quarterback. And that was the firewall, because even though San Francisco knows they're not getting Zach Wilson, if the Jets do something else, that's the player they take. So that's the firewall. The Eagles can't get him. The Eagles knew they couldn't get him, didn't feel comfortable. I've said since day one it's always about evaluation, so they don't feel comfortable with Justin Fields or Trey Lance, and they move back. That's why they moved back, because the firewall was there.
Well, a guy like Jamar Chase, when is he going to get selected, in your mind?
He's going to go probably as early as 5. But yeah, I mean, people are going to get angry because there's a really good chance that when we're sitting there on draft night, that Jamar Chase and Kyle Pitts are going to both be there at 6. And it goes back to what I told you with Kyle Pitts, period. They're not taking that position at 6. They're not taking a wide receiver at 6. And they're certainly not taking a receiver after 2 years where they've taken receivers with premium picks. Now, I understand what everyone's going to say. Those guys aren't any good. Chase is great. A, you don't know that. B, you're probably right. I think he's going to be a great player. But you don't know that. And we've seen bigger can't misses than that miss. But it doesn't have anything to do with that. It has to do with what you just brought up with Bill Belichick, and that's the valuation of the position. It is not a position that you take at 6 in the draft according to the Philadelphia Eagles. And to be honest, if you're going to be fair, they've been more successful than most organizations. And I think the best example of this is probably Calvin Johnson. And the reason why is because Calvin was picked number 2 overall. You're not getting a better receiver than Calvin Johnson unless you're getting Jerry Rice or Randy Moss. Jamar Chase isn't better. Insert name isn't better. Period. You're not getting a better receiver than Calvin Johnson. He was phenomenal. And what did he do for the Detroit Lions? And that's not Calvin Johnson's fault.
Yeah.
Because it's their job to build up the other positions. They weren't able to do that. The point I'm trying to make is there's only so much impact you can have on a game as a receiver. By the nature of the position, you need a vehicle to get you to football, number one. And number two, no matter, even if you are Jerry Rice or Randy Moss or Calvin Johnson, and you're having one of your best games, what are you going to touch it? 10, 12 times? The valuation isn't there.
It's an interesting conversation, and we'll talk more about it tomorrow and throughout the week. And, John, we only have about a minute or so left, but something we have to get to before you leave us here is the 17-game regular season schedule and everything else that could be in the works for a change as early as this upcoming season. What do you know?
Yeah, I mean, it's going to happen. No question about that. And that was pretty much put into the new CBA when the new TV deals were going to come into existence. There was going to be some media kickers, as they call it, that would insert that 17th game. The NFLPA is going to, claim victory by lopping off one preseason game. So in the theory from their standpoint, as the injuries statistics show, there are more injuries in preseason than regular season, but we all knew this was going to happen. They were eventually going to get there, and this is the year, 2021, 17 games, get used to it. So more unbalanced. The NFL schedule is already incredibly unbalanced. Now it even gets more unbalanced because you have to talk about 1 year, one conference is going to have home games 1 year. The next conference is going to have home games. So you're going to have that advantage baked in. You're going to have international games. It's going to be crazy.
We'll get to more of that tomorrow night right here at 7:30 with our NFL Eagles insider, John McMullen, every night at 7:30. Follow John on Twitter at JFMcMullen. All right, John, I appreciate it, man. We'll do it again tomorrow.
All right, thanks, Ron.
Yep, thank you. There he is, Johnny Mack. All right, let's get to a break.
Football in Philadelphia is a lifestyle, a passion from birth, and a personal responsibility to know the game. Boo when necessary. And think about EAGLES! Eagles! Every second of every minute of every hour of every day. Birds 365 was created for you. Jody Mack, the legendary sports talker, joins forces with NFL insider John McMullen. Birds 365. Start your morning with Johnny Mack and Jody Mack across the JAKIB Media Network. Watch it live on YouTube.